I'm Tom Lamar Beauchamp. I teach at Georgetown University, where I'm a senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute and a professor of philosophy in the philosophy department, and my background is in philosophy.
When the work of the commission began, what was your role as part of the commission?
When the commission began, I didn't have a role because I was not at the time on the staff. I joined the staff after they had the Belmont retreat. So at the beginning, I had no role, which is just to say I wasn't there from the start.
But then as you joined the commission at work, what was your role?
My role was to write the Belmont report. That was my staff assignment, and that's what I did the entire time I was there, which was 2 years.
If you joined the commission after they had already started to discuss their work, and you were brought on to author the document that became known as the Belmont Report, how did you get caught up on all of their discussions and become aware of their thinking to capture it in the report itself?
Actually, I didn't, in any sense, inquire into the nature of the discussions except to talk to Michael Yesley, the staff director, about it. And the long and the short of that conversation went something like this. The commission at its retreat identified these 3 principles. And I said, what do these 3 principles mean? And he said, I'm really not sure, and I'm not sure the commission is sure, but it's your job to find out, right? So rather than suggesting that I take a retrospective view, he was suggesting that I take a prospective view, figure out by talking to commissioners and other members of the staff what they thought these principles meant, and then to reflect on the body of a document that I was to write what that was. He did say at the time, there exists a staff document, but he said, I wouldn't expect too much from it, or some words to that effect. That document I've given you, that is to say, the existing state of the Belmont Report as it was in late 1976. So I used that document, and then I talked with people on the staff and the commissioners.
When you completed your draft version of the report, it presumably went to the commission members. How did they like it?
They thought it was too philosophical. It's not that they disliked the basic discussion of the principles, respect for persons and beneficence and justice and so on. They thought that was, nice start and so on, but they thought the document was too philosophical, had to be pared back so that someone who's not a philosopher would be able to sustain interest and would be readable by, say, people who worked on IRBs. So they proceeded to tell me to take a lot of the philosophy out of it. Omit any references that might be made to great classical philosophers like Kant or Mill or something like that, which I did. So a tremendous amount of stuff that I had written hit the cutting room floor.
Did you anticipate that the document that you had completed would still be as widely read and used as it is today?
No, I think it was unimaginable, absolutely unimaginable that would occur. The document had only one purpose. It was really to explain the framework principles that the commission operated on in delivering what we all thought would be the most important thing we were doing, which is the other 16 volumes or so. That is to say, those volumes that were on very specific matters that we all knew could be weighty because they would pass through the office of DHEW and then into law. Either that or some reason had to be given for them not passing into law. So we all knew that was a very weighty consideration. Basically, we thought of Belmont as a kind of background consideration. In fact, when Michael first assigned the job to me to write the Belmont Report, I thought it was because I was a new kid on the block on the staff, and I was getting the dregs of the assignment, right? Because it was what nobody else wanted to do.
Was there a social climate or a political climate at that time that had to do with people's rights that affected the writing of the report?
Oh, absolutely. This is historically a follow-through of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, broadly construed, the rights of individuals and the rush to those kinds of considerations. I don't think there's any question. If there hadn't been that prior history, I rather doubt that we would have seen this history of the National Commission. Of course, there are a lot of other historical foundations, too, like Tuskegee, but yes.
Then what effect did the Tuskegee syphilis experiments have on the thinking and the the drive to a product that you had.
Yeah, I don't think Tuskegee had itself the actual details of the case and what was concluded by the ad hoc committee that evaluated it. I don't think had that much actual impact on the commission, except to serve as a background to say you may find more things like this in the area in which you're looking, the areas in which you're looking, which is the children and the like. You should be prepared for it, and you should be sure that these kinds of things never occur. It was just a big red flag that we all knew was there.
But in retrospect now, of having had years of thinking about and looking at today's climate, are there things you wish you had put in the Belmont report to cover some of the situations that we have today?
Not really. I don't think about revisions needed in Belmont in that way. Maybe in some of the other commission documents. For sure, if you're going to the other commission documents, like prisoners, for example, I was never in favor of the prisoner report. I didn't like it then. I don't like it now. I don't think that the present rules about prisoners are the kind of system that we should have. So I would significantly rethink that volume. So far as Belmont itself is concerned, though, what I wish the commissioners had done is to keep the differences between the three principles straighter than they did. In particular, I thought the first principle, the principle of respect for persons, was a kind of mishmash of considerations of beneficence and non-maleficence rolled into respect for persons, and they should have kept that separate. So I would like to see those principles rewritten and restructured in certain ways, but I argued that at the time, and other people argued that at the time, and we didn't prevail. That's the way it goes in an international commission.
What was your thinking primarily as it related to research in the U.S., or were you thinking of the international scale as well?
I think that ought to be distinguished between the Belmont report and then the other reports of the commission. That is to say, the theoretical framework, which is what Belmont is, and then the practical guidelines that are put out in the other documents. I don't think we ever thought of the practical guidelines as being guidelines for anybody other than citizens and investigators of the United States. That is to say, if that's what we were writing for, that was the audience, that's what it was intended for. I do think, though, that in the case of the Belmont report, that was always thought of as something that was an expression of universal values and therefore was as applicable to anyone in any circumstance who conducts human research as it is to people who are either Americans doing research here or others doing research in America or Americans doing research abroad. It would apply equally to any, in other words, the idea is any responsible research investigator or any responsible research committee would take account of these considerations. Otherwise, if they didn't, they would be acting unethically.
As the three principles of the ethics were they considered to be of equal importance, or does one trump another one?
There's no trumping criterion or condition whatsoever in the Belmont report. And it was written specifically on that model. It's not supposed to be a trumping consideration. Let's say justice is not supposed to outweigh autonomy, or autonomy outweigh justice, or something of that sort. And it's set up specifically in terms of prima facie principles. That is to say, those that coming into a particular deliberation, each of them have equal weight. That's well and good as a theoretical matter. Does it work out that way practically as the commission begins its deliberation? I think the answer is no, for a couple of reasons. One, I think justice is severely downplayed. There's actually very little discussion of justice. The main application has to do with the selection of subjects, the just selection of subjects. Very little attention is given to that problem, either in the deliberations of the commission. It does come up from time to time, but very little time. So justice becomes a distant third consideration. Second matter, I think that respect for persons actually is the most important principle. And for this reason, it becomes a kind of threshold condition. If you don't have adequate informed consent, either of a first party or a third party, you can't proceed with the research. So it has a kind of priority position in terms of telling you what can be done and what can't be done. The next most important principle by far is the principle of beneficence. And justice then is a sort of trailing third. So for both of those reasons, I think there is a kind of structured, though quite implicit set of, it's not trumping considerations, and it's not quite hierarchical. It's a matter of which weight you think one of the principles has in going into any given discussion.
How many of the medical schools have a course on ethics that would train investigators on how to think about ethics as opposed to think of their specialty in medicine?
Yeah, I think it's not so much how many of the 120 or so medical schools that we have in this country actually teach something like that, rather to structure it in terms of a continuum. There are some institutions, some medical schools, where there's nothing at all. Absolute zero. Maybe the most that would be transmitted is you're expected to know certain kind of things in order to be board certified, right? But we don't teach you that. Right up to institutions that have a rather large ethics faculty, like the University of Texas at Galveston, where you've got maybe 10 people running a pretty significant ethics shop in-house, and everything in between. So I think of it in terms of a continuum. Is the training adequate? No doubt it's not. On the other hand, no doubt some of the training is inadequate in some other areas that they're preparing for as research investigators as well. It becomes a matter, I think, in these institutions of balancing what it is that you need to know, and ethics often gets balanced out as a distant second.
There are a lot of people who feel that we're not handling the conflict of interest process well today yet, despite how important it is and how much discussion there's been. Are we, in fact, achieving through the consent process what you had hoped we would when you talked about it?
No, I don't think so. I think of the consent process, to use the same analogy I used a minute ago, to a continuum. I think there are people who are conducting research in this country who are not getting something even close to an informed consent. There would be some minimum disclosure of information on a sheet of paper, and that would be it. Then people would be expected to sign a sheet in effect, waiving their rights. There's a lot of protection of institutions. Risk management is the dignified word for it in some categories. It's not really informed consent at all. It's an attempt to get a document that's called an informed consent document or a form, but it actually does much more to protect the institution. There's that kind of thing all the way up to the highest levels of getting informed consent for research, where people really know what they're doing, and I think there's everything in between. The problem is, the general problem, I think, to go down lower on the continuum, that is, say, those cases where we say we're getting informed consent, but we're not actually getting informed consent, has to do with not having adequate monitoring facilities on the one hand, and having inadequately trained people getting those consents in the first place. I think that's what's wrong with the system.
As you wrote the Belmont report, there was a lot of attention paid to vulnerable subjects, vulnerable groups of people, in the sense that they needed to be protected. But today we have regulations and we have things that encourage that women participate in research, that children are subjects of research. Are we moving in the wrong direction compared to what you thought was the right thing when you wrote the Belmont report?
No, I think it's a balancing consideration. I think we've moved in the right direction. Think of it as a two-phase movement. We moved in the direction of providing adequate protections, increased protections to vulnerable populations. It's not as though the idea of protecting vulnerable populations had never occurred to us until the Tuskegee ad hoc report or the report of the National Commission. Of course it has. But we decided to increase protections in the system, and I think there was undoubtedly in the National Commission, and this deserves underlining, undoubtedly a conception of a research subject as somebody who is being burdened. And you can find hundreds and hundreds of lines in commission reports and in the transcripts of the meetings in which exactly that is suggested. Being a research subject is a burden. I don't think it was ever a positive spin on the idea of being a research subject, that it was not just a burden to the individual, but was actually considered a benefit, or if not a benefit, then potentially a benefit for a class of persons that person represented. AIDS activism and the aftermath in the scientific community, I think, changed all of that in the direction of, as you see, a lot of people thinking, like people who are interested in juvenile diabetes or whatever, thinking that research is the answer and wanting to actually enroll subjects and conduct trials and the like. Both are right. I We need to adequately protect vulnerable people. We also need to do more research, because research, after all, protects people as well. That's the whole point of research, is to protect people against injury and disease and the like. So it becomes a balancing consideration. I think the Commission was lopsided, yes. Maybe some people who want expedited trials at the FDA have a lopsided notion in the other direction. Maybe they want it to be too expedited. So what we need to find is a balance between the two.